30th United Nations Climate Change Conference, that is the COP30, has now opened in Belém in Brazil, in the heart of the Amazon. Welcome to Deep Dive on NewsX World. I am Pia, and today we discuss how this year's summit is not just about climate policies or carbon targets, it's also about who gets to speak for the planet. Now, for the very first time in COP history, Indigenous participation has reached unprecedented levels, with around 2,500 representatives gathering from across Brazil and beyond. Their message is absolutely clear, that the climate fight cannot be won without Indigenous leadership and recognition. Yet, beneath this particular record turnout lies familiar challenge: representation without real participation. We've learned that only 14% of Indigenous attendees, which is roughly about 360 individuals, have secured access to the blue zone, which is the restricted area where official negotiations are taking place. The Coalition of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, also known as APIB, has coordinated much of this presence, nominating leaders through Brazil's foreign ministry. However, those with credentials can observe negotiations but not vote or join closed sessions, limiting their influence in decision-making. Now, the Brazilian government, under President Luiz Lula da Silva, has made visible efforts to include Indigenous peoples in the broader COP experience. Initiatives like the People's Circle, the COP Village at the Federal University of Para, and the Green Zone Pavilion were designed to amplify grassroots voices. Still, Indigenous leaders such as Atoya Mancineri from the Amazon's Coordination of Indigenous Organizations insists that this is not enough. He argues that true inclusion means Indigenous representatives must sit within the official negotiation delegations and not just around them. Others, like Lucas Tupinamba, who traveled 2 days by boat to attend, have voiced their frustration over the cost and exclusivity of the event itself. He's criticized the distance between the conference and the realities faced by communities living along the Amazon's rivers, where mining, dredging and oil exploration continue to threaten their lands. Now, the Indigenous agenda at COP30 is being shaped around a core demand: making land demarcation, the formal recognition of Indigenous territories, as an official climate policy within Brazil's nationally determined contributions. Now, the APIB's campaign, called We Are the Answer, argues that protecting Indigenous lands is not just symbolic, but is a concrete climate solution. In fact, President Lula had appeared to back that stance, urging global leaders to recognize the role of Indigenous territories in mitigation efforts. But even as the summit progresses, tensions have surfaced. Last night, in fact, tussle had broken out at the COP30 venue when Indigenous and non-Indigenous protesters stormed the conference center. They chanted that they cannot decide for us without us, which is a stark reminder that participation without decision-making remains a sore point. Security forces, of course, responded, and while no major injuries were reported, this moment, of course, you can see in the visuals on your screen the depth of frustration amongst the activists. Let's listen in to what some of the protesters have had to say.
Estava acontecendo a marcha de saúde e do clima que estava vindo da Embaixada dos Povos com os povos indígenas, e aí eles chegaram aqui, né, e não estavam sendo bem recebidos, inclusive foram dispersos lá na frente pela polícia para que não chegassem aqui na zona azul da COP30. E aqui, chegando aqui, eles entraram dentro do espaço da COP30 para poder reivindicar com relação à questão de que a COP continua, né, a COP vai acabar, mas a destruição continua.
Dizer que foi um absurdo a repressão feita, né? Poderiam ter conversado, poderiam ter colocado uma comissão lá dentro para falar com os governantes, mas isso não aconteceu. Então, a policial, o movimento indígena queria apresentar sua pauta lá dentro, né, da Zona Azul, da Blue Zone, e aí eles não deixaram, aí houve muita enfrentamento, pancadaria mesmo ali na entrada.
Now, the events in Belém highlight a turning point in global climate diplomacy. For decades, Indigenous peoples have been treated as participants and not partners in such discussions focusing on addressing the climate crisis. But their territories hold about 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, and their stewardship has long protected ecosystems that sustain the planet. COP30 could become the moment that finally redefines climate justice as climate inclusion. If Brazil does succeed in embedding indigenous land demarcation into its national climate policy, it could set a global precedent, linking environmental protection directly to indigenous sovereignty. Listen in to what Sonia Guajajara, Brazil's Minister of Indigenous Peoples, has said.
Comprovadamente, a presença indígena, seja em território demarcado ou não, é garantia de água limpa, de biodiversidade protegida, de alimentação sem veneno, de floresta em pé, e tudo isso é o que a humanidade precisa para continuar existindo. Portanto, a gente diz, né, sem os povos indígenas, sem essas vozes, não há futuro para a humanidade. Uma COP na Amazônia precisa considerar as vozes indígenas, das comunidades tradicionais, né, de todas as pessoas que sempre tiveram muita dificuldade de chegar onde a COP acontece.
Yet, as protests and tensions show, symbolic gestures are no longer enough. Indigenous leaders are now calling for seats inside negotiation rooms and not just on the sidelines. Their presence in Belém, which is of course in record numbers, is sending a message that the world cannot claim to save the Amazon without listening to those who live within it. In fact, joining us in this discussion is a very special guest, Mr. Dan Perry. He is an analyst joining us from Tel Aviv. Thank you so much for taking out time and speaking to us on NewsX World. Of course, the world's eyes are trained towards what's happening in Brazil with the COP30. Several high-profile leaders are on the ground, but what's also been done is an effort by Brazil to include indigenous peoples. Somehow, only 14% of those who have been allowed to attend the conference are at the negotiating table. What else really needs to be done? Because when it comes down to it, indigenous solutions have proven effective in order to tackle the climate crisis.
Well, indigenous people, as you mentioned, control or manage a surprisingly high proportion of the world's landmass, over 20%, and that includes much of the world's biodiversity, again, as you said, the majority of the world's biodiversity. The COP process historically has been based on the assumption, or at least the hope, that the world's governments might unite in a multilateral effort to address what is a global emergency. And I would not personally look at this as a matter of inclusiveness as much as a question of practicality. How do we avert this coming, or indeed already happening, global emergency? Now, it is logical to include indigenous peoples to the extent that there is clear data showing that when they lose control of land and it moves into the hands of governments and industries, the result for the climate, the result for carbon is net negative. So it's clear that this is a good idea. But the bigger picture is that the world's governments have basically failed in their goal. It's now largely accepted that the world will miss the 1.5 degrees Celsius maximum increase by the end of the century in global temperatures versus pre-industrial times. And then the question is, well, is that really true? And that would be catastrophic for small island nations because the seas will rise and many of them will vanish, and it will also erode or push in coastlines all over the world. So cities like New York and Amsterdam are in danger. But also what to do. And I believe what we're seeing is a process where there is acceptance, on the one hand, that we might miss that goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius, but on the other hand, that the whole idea that the world's nations working together can arrive at agreements maybe isn't the way to go. And maybe we need to look at sub-national categories, and that includes, obviously, because of the data we mentioned before, indigenous peoples in particular. Obviously, in a place like Brazil with the Amazon rainforest, that is one of the world's major centers of potential calamity that needs to be addressed. But not just indigenous peoples, also industries and large companies might become a factor here. Cities and regions that have autonomy or that have at least control within countries might become far more relevant than we had thought when we were still dreaming about global cooperation, as reflected in the 2015-2016 Paris Accord. And obviously, when it comes to the failure of nations to collaborate, the number one culprit is embarrassing to me, as you can tell by my accent, the United States, which historically has accounted for a quarter of all CO2 emissions,
Yes.
And yet denies its current administration, denies climate change. President Trump calls it the world's biggest hoax. He has an obsession with windmills because they're ugly or some nonsense. It's a true catastrophe. And so we see that the U.S. basically is not present in Brazil, as opposed to India, which has a large delegation led by a minister, as opposed to European delegations, as opposed to China. And it is absurd because China, we're not used to seeing China as like a good faith player for the common good of humanity, and yet China is about to lead the world in both deployment of and research into and investment in renewable energy.
Indeed, you've touched upon Donald Trump's boycott. He, of course, pulled out of the Paris Agreement with the executive order that he'd signed as soon as he stepped into the Oval Office. But we've also seen a sort of backsliding take place in Europe as well, as far as the emissions goal is concerned. In light of these developments, especially America's absence at the COP30, could we now see countries such as Brazil, BRICS countries, now stepping in and taking the lead?
I think it's very much essential that the global South maybe not take the lead, but play a proportionate role to their increasing strength in the world economy. And the fact that they represent a huge amount of the world's landmass and biodiversity. A lot of this can be done on the local level, moving power grids through renewable energy, electrifying vehicles, protecting green spaces. That can be done by states and cities even in various places, retrofitting buildings to be carbon positive. But obviously much of it still has to be done by countries. A big issue here, by the way, you mentioned the European Union. They still lead the world in climate finance. And much of the issue here is helping poorer countries that are relevant to the issue finance the mitigation process that they have to take part in. It is unfair for these poorer countries that both lack the funding but haven't in the past been large emitters to not be assisted. So obviously the U.S. isn't going to do that under the current administration, and that is an embarrassment and a tragedy and a huge unfairness. But I think Europe still is doing that. And a country like Brazil, that is essentially now a middle-income country, same might be said, by the way, of India, no longer can just be a recipient of assistance. And yes, I agree with the premise of your question. They really have to take the lead, and I believe under Lula they are. Under the previous president Bolsonaro, who was Trumpier, of course, none of that could be hoped for. This really is a question that needs to be front and center, and I think maybe some way might be found to punish countries that continue to deny climate change. At the same time, it must be said that there was a very interesting article that came out recently by Bill Gates, who generally speaking is respected as a positive player in these matters. And he argues that there was, that essentially, I'm not sure he says this directly, but in effect, that the climate hysteria that suggested that if we miss the target, then this is the end of days and humanity will disappear, was excessive. That you don't have to deny climate change, as Trump does, to not go quite that far. And that assisted the deniers in claiming that the movement, that the climate activism is somehow self-interested or nonsensical. That claim is wrong. But the overreaching helped the enemies of addressing climate change in their nefarious task. So I think Gates argues that we must move to mitigation, because the prevention of passing the 1.5 degree rise goal will fail, basically. And then it comes down to, how do we help countries, poorer countries that are going to be affected, overcome and have it not be catastrophic if indeed we end up having to deal with a 2 degree rise.
Absolutely. With that, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Dan Perry, for taking out time and, of course, putting all of that into context and perspective for our viewers. On that note, we dip into a quick short break. We'll be back with more on NewsX World Deep Dive. you.